Welcome to Baruch College. On behalf of the Robert Zicklin Center for Corporate Integrity and our partners in this event tonight, the CEO Trust and the C-Suite Trust, with whom we're very, very happy to be collaborating on this important issue tonight, I welcome you to the school. I welcome you to this venue and to an important discussion that will proceed throughout the evening. The title of this evening's event, or the subtitle I should say, really says it all when we start thinking about the importance of some of the issues that face us with respect to the debt. The bequest to the next generation. Thinking not only about numbers today, but how those numbers resonate across decades and generations to come. We have a terrific speaker to talk about these issues tonight, and he will be introduced by a person who is CEO trustee, that is a trustee of the CEO Trust, and the Chief Executive Officer of WaterJel Technologies. It is my pleasure to bring to the podium now Mike Lorelli.
So, good evening, everybody. And I'm Mike Lorelli, CEO of WaterJel Technologies. We are in the burn care products business. And I say with a straight face that we make products that we hope people never need. But we solve a lot of industrial problems. And we do some very good service for the military as well as the consumer marketplace. We only have one ground rule for the evening. And that is our cell phone policy, so can everybody turn their cell phones off, myself included? And this is the CEO Trust's first global event for reasons. How cool is that, right? So tonight we have the CEO Trust, founded in New York, and the C-Suite Trust, as well as the newborn Connecticut CEO Trust chapter. And I have to say, it's just great to have students, in the audience for lots of reasons that we'll get into. But the students are really not our guests. You've invited us into your home, and that's kind of cool. So we really appreciate you're inviting us into your marketplace. We want to thank the people from Baruch that made this event possible for us in the venue, Matt LaFrere, David, of course, and Don Shepherds. And I certainly want to acknowledge probably the most important person that makes all these events come together, and that's CEO's Trust founder, chairperson, Teresa Boyce. You got to stand up, please. And Michelle Walker, who probably is not in the room, but is our administrative support, we probably saw outside. Well, our topic this evening is the U.S. debt, our bequest. Sorry? Okay, good. That is a great question, and thank you. CEO Trust is a group of largely CEOs and other C-level members in the tri-state area that have come together for a common cause, and that's sharing ideas, helping one another, supporting each other's values. And we all kind of have a little selfish need too. It is lonely at the top, I will say, as a CEO. You got to get outside of your own sandbox for intellectual stimulation. So we put together a calendar of events over the course of a 12-month period. So we bring in very interesting and engaging speakers like Marc. And that gives us a great occasion to come together and just share ideas and thoughts and mingle. That's a great question. Okay. Now, back to Marc for a second. After generations and generations of parents accumulating wealth and passing it along to their kids, we indeed have a 180 on our hands, and probably a very sorry state of affairs. They left assets, our parents, and it looks like we're leaving debts and IOUs. So from the day the next generation is born, they kind of start like 30 yards behind the starting line. So there's something wrong with that situation. Now I remember, and I talked to Marc about this, when Ronald Reagan campaigned the second time, in 1984, he was asked, in one of the sessions, well, aren't you worried about the debt? And his answer was, if any of you remember, this is a test of your age, okay? I don't have to worry about it, it's big enough to take care of itself. Now, at the time that was funny, and at the time that was 40% of the GDP. Well, guess what? Today, it's 95% of GDP. That's a sea change. So maybe it's fitting that we have a good number of students in the audience, because this is humbling for us, because we should all start feeling very, very guilty. Now, when the CEO Trust Program Committee met 4 or 5 months ago and convened on the topics for the calendar for the 12 months, a fast nomination was Marc Hodak, a previous speaker, friend of the CEO Trust, and several of us had listened to him previously and really were impressed with his macro grasp of these kinds of situations. Marc also believes that for every complex problem, there's a solution that's straightforward, simple, explainable to the public, and wrong. He'll show how lack of governance is the real root of the problem. Now, it's hard to capture Marc in a few paragraphs. He runs a successful global consulting practice, Hodak Value Advisors. He's an adjunct professor at NYU. When the Nobel Peace Prize in Economics was awarded in 2007 for work in mechanism design, the major news outlets were able to find only a few academics to explain what all that meant. One was Marc. He's been quoted in journals, spoken at forums throughout the world. He earned his MBA in finance from the Wharton School. He did his bachelor's in aerospace engineering at University of Maryland and was admitted to the bar in 1984. Let's give a warm welcome to Marc.
Thank you, Mike, for that warm and generous introduction. I also want to thank the Baruch College, the School of Public Affairs, and the Robert Zicklin Center for Corporate Integrity for inviting me, for providing this wonderful venue, and of course CEO Trust, the C-Suite Trust groups for inviting me and creating this forum as well. I also feel like I have to thank Larry Zicklin himself. I probably wouldn't be up here on a number of counts if it wasn't for Larry. He's been, over the years, an amazing mentor and friend. He got me started. He actually pulled me into NYU as a professor. And it was in a discussion years ago, before the financial crisis, when we were talking about big issues, that we were talking about the debt. And I had a particular view on it. And he was one of the people that actually encouraged me to follow that route of inquiry to see where it would take us. And you're going to see really the fruits of that discovery tonight. As Mike said, it's great to have students in the audience here. When I was in college, a movie that was pretty big at the time was Raiders of the Lost Ark. Raiders, a great film, if you haven't seen it. At the end of the movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, they had the Ark that they were opening up. The Nazis had captured this thing. They were opening up the Ark. And we couldn't see what was in the Ark, but you could tell by the look on their faces what their reaction was to the thing that was in it. The reaction was pretty horrific. These are the faces of Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson on September 22nd, 2008. Whatever it was that they saw in the numbers in the wake of the Lehman collapse that day turned two of the most pro-market senior U.S. government officials in history into panicked interventionists ready to commit unprecedented amounts of public money. When George Bush was interviewed last year and asked how somebody like him, a staunch conservative, could have backed such an immense bailout, he answered very simply, and I think probably appropriately, well, I didn't want to be president when the banking system collapsed. If the U.S. ever defaulted on its debt, it would be this kind of a moment. The U.S. is too big to save. No combination of entities in the world could support us for more than a few hours once serious doubts began to set in about U.S. bonds. There would be nowhere safe to park their assets, and that would intensify and spread the financial damage. Once the U.S. bond market began to collapse, the term pennies on the dollar would become ironically inadequate because the dollar itself would be so devalued. That devaluation would manifest as a surge in commodity prices amid weak demand, at first by large percentages and then by multiples. If the United States dollar is the global reserve currency at the time of that surge, it would initiate a very frightening chain of events. What pundits, I think, loosely these days globally call the canned foods and ammo scenario. Within 24 hours, all the nations in the world that have a strong amount of dollar-denominated assets, countries like Japan, China, Brazil for certain, probably the UK, Hong Kong, Mexico, would see their own currencies pounded into submission. Their banks would see their overnight loans cut off by the creditors who are worried about their own liquidity, and they would fail en masse. That would trigger failures throughout Asia and continental Europe. The banks would fail, the weak countries would fail, the euro would unravel. And every bank doing business in euros, rubles, pesos, yen would fail, one after another, until the global banking system was reduced to ashes. Trade would abruptly come to a halt. Trade is entirely dependent on credit. Ships would be sitting in harbors laden with their goods, waiting to be looted of their final cargoes in all likelihood. Food production would continue as best as the supply could be protected, but the distribution and processing would be severely hamstrung until a system of local credit could be reestablished among interdependent growing regions. That would probably not happen fast enough to prevent a significant fall in food production due to the shortages of fuel, fertilizer, machine parts that modern agriculture depends on. We could very well be pushed back to Depression-era conditions, except with a population about 3 times the size that we had back then, which is probably a significantly higher number that would probably be fed by a crippled world economy. As shortages of everything spread and the funds to maintain an effective state began to dwindle, the communities with the longest, the deepest roots in the rule of law and the most assets, they would be struggling to maintain order. Many, maybe most communities would begin to see gangs competing to provide protection, and the weakest communities would simply descend into chaos. With nations all of a sudden inwardly looking to maintain control within their borders, there would be a dash to secure key resources and a rush to settle old territorial scores, which is always simmering under the surface, and the wars would begin. Now, it's really useful to ask, how likely is this nightmare scenario? The answer is that it is a mathematical certainty that the U.S. will default on its debt at some point in the next 30 years, given the current financial trajectory and given the current governance system. And that's a time frame in which the U.S. is still the dominant economy, and its collapse would be a global catastrophe. China simply cannot catch up that fast. Now, this is some pictures about what the collapse would look like. The debt itself is only about $9 trillion, 60% of GDP. You hear a lot of economists say, well, we can handle that. I mean, $200 billion a year in interest payments, that's only 10% of the tax income that we're getting. And that's true. As far as it goes, we can handle that. Well, by we, I mean you young people paying for the retirement and medical bills of those of us who will be going into old age. Thank you very much. The morality aside, there are a lot of countries that have much higher debt to GDP ratios than 60%. Japan's is almost 200%. And the United States itself has been over 100%. By the way, 60% of GDP, you heard Mike Lorelli earlier say 95%. Those are two numbers that float out there. 95% includes the debt that the government owes itself in the Social Security Trust Fund, and the 60% excludes that debt. It's just the debt that's owed to the public, just in case people are following the numbers. So I'm looking at just the public debt, not counting the Social Security obligations, which is what the government owes out of this pocket to put into this pocket. So the United States was at over 100% at the end of World War II, and we cut it back down very nicely over the next several decades. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that the United States of 2011 is a fiscally different animal than the United States in the immediate post-war period. Remember, debt is created by deficits. And the deficits of the post-war period evaporated when the United States no longer had to spend huge amounts of money for soldiers and planes and tanks. Today, we have a structural deficit driven by things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, as well as interest on the debt. This structural deficit, the difference between this revenue line, which is the income, and the expense line, is currently requiring the government to go out and borrow a fresh $4 billion a day. By the way, one of the things we had going for us at the end of World War II is that the maturity of the debt was about 9 years, which meant that we didn't have to go back to the well very often to replace maturing debt. Today, the maturity of the debt is about 4 years, and we have to go out and replace maturing debt to the tune of another $4 billion a day. This black hole of borrowing is enough to suck in the market value of a Microsoft or Exxon or Walmart every single month. Now, on top of the mandatory, these are called mandatory expenditures, you have what they call discretionary expenditures. And that's actually what everything else that we think of as government. It's the military, it's the roads, it's the court system. That's actually projected to shrink over the next couple of decades somewhat. But at some point, this continued borrowing, you can see like by 2040, all of the income is going to be taken up by Social Security net interest. In fact, almost 75% of income taxes are going to be used simply to pay out interest on the debt. But long before we get to that point, I think the younger generation will have been exhausted in terms of their patience. And I think, frankly, the credit markets will have exhausted our borrowing capacity. At some point, it becomes too much. And all the rest of the consequences follow as surely as clogged arteries will eventually trigger a heart attack. Now, there are four ways of dealing with something like this, right? You can raise taxes, you can cut spending, you can try inflation, you can pray like hell for a lot of growth. But when analysts look at these options in any kind of detail, they quickly find that the path to getting there is a little bit more obscure than they originally thought. It's kind of like being in a nightmare where you think you intuitively know which way to go, but everywhere you turn, all of a sudden looks unfamiliar and dangerous. The most elegant way of dealing with this problem would be to grow our way out of it. That was half the solution with post-war debt. We grew our way out of half of it. We inflated our way out of the other half. The problem is that we would have to grow economically at 8% per year just to keep up with the spending growth. Now, the United States, over the last century, has averaged 2 to 3% per year growth. 4% a year is considered really good. And besides, any of the other tools that we use to try and deal with this deficit, higher taxes, reduced spending, inflation, all have the effect of reducing economic growth. So it's unfortunately very unlikely that economic growth is going to save us this time. Well, if you're in deep hawk, it seems like the ability to dial up taxes as high as you need to go would be a pretty good thing to do, a pretty useful tool to have. Taxes would have to go up, according to the General Accounting Office, which all these statistics come from. They'd have to go up by about 60% very quickly in order to take care of this debt, take care of the spending moving forward. But the GAO actually only predicts income taxes to go up to 19% of GDP. 60% higher means you have to add 15 percentage points of GDP to the income, government revenues. Well, the reason the GAO predicts 19% is because when they look back over the last 5 decades, when tax rates have been as low as 28% and as high as 92%, actual revenue per GDP has been in a very narrow band of 16 to 21%. So it's really hard to figure how fiddling with the tax rate, even with those kinds of extremes, is going to create a much different outcome going forward in the future, especially when you're talking about income taxes, which have a particularly potent effect, negative effect on economic growth. So we're down to spending. Spending is ultimately the only way to deal with this. The government has, and it will again, raise the age before which you can start cashing in your Social Security. They will begin to reduce benefits to people who are working later into their retirement, what would be their retirement years. They'll take the cap off the payroll tax in order to get more money from the wealthy. And then they'll tell the wealthy they're going to limit your benefits by some form of means testing. They're going to reduce the benefits for people who have scrimped on their luxuries, on their housing, on their vacations, in order to build up more for their retirement, so they can maintain the benefits of the people who couldn't or didn't do that. All of these things are probably going to happen. And all of these things, if you add them up, will probably take care of the Social Security portion of the deficit. But the Social Security portion of the deficit is only $11 trillion. The Medicare portion of the deficit is over 3 times that. And so they will raise payroll taxes again. They will increase premiums and deductibles to seniors. They will probably begin the means test Medicare, access to Medicare. They may get to the point where you really can't get full coverage for Medicare until you spend down your assets like they do with Medicaid. And even that won't be quite enough. They'll have to begin to cut back payments to providers, ration medical care in the manner that every country does that has government-funded medical care. So, if they're going to deal with this expenditure problem, entitlement problem, the government's going to have to cut these payments, these costs by 40% right away. And the longer they wait, the more they'll have to cut. And the history has not been very promising in this work. The government has been very poor about cutting benefits because they affect so many people so potently. When they cut payments to the doctors just a few years ago, they rescinded that when they saw the effect on actual patient care, and the voters noticed it. It's pretty obvious why you get dithering on the part of government officials to cut costs. A significant amount of cost cutting would be, in effect, a breach for the taxpayers who have been forced, of their expectations. They've been told for decades as they've been forced to pay into these programs, this is what you're going to get. Imagine if a private company that was providing annuities or providing health insurance all of a sudden said, we're going to cut back what you get, we're going to means test what you get. There would be a howl of protest. You really can't expect a whole lot different reaction when the government's providing these programs. And that's what you're going to get. And so we're going to have it's almost politically futile. Anytime they make significant cuts, the people who are responsible for those cuts will be removed, because not only are people losing their benefits, but there'll probably be an economic slowdown at the same time because the cuts are so significant. And amid a firestorm of resentment and economic stagnation, they'll throw the bums out. And the people who come back in will very likely, as they have in the past, at least partially restore what was taken away. It's going to be very, very difficult for these cuts to happen. But you can't get too far into a discussion of the debt without noting that, well, doesn't government control the money supply mean never having to default? A number of Fed chairmen have reminded us we can print more. The problem is that the underlying cause of the debt is the deficit, and the underlying cause of the deficit is the growth of these entitlement programs. And these entitlement programs are more or less indexed to inflation. So if inflation started kicking in, the cost of these programs would go up. And because the terms of our debt is now relatively short, as I said, it's about 4 years, and we're going back to the market very frequently to get new debt, and these costs are going up, we'd be going into the market once inflation kicks in at higher and higher interest rates. And the higher interest rates will create higher interest costs, which will create a higher deficit, which will create more debt, and you get into what's called a debt spiral. Ultimately, the problem isn't the debt per se. It's the fact that at some point, as this is going on, the government is going to have to choose between defaulting on public debt or significantly defaulting on its unfunded liabilities. In other words, the government is going to have to eventually make a choice. Do we stiff the Chinese, or do we cut off Iran? That's what the political choice is ultimately going to come down to. And you can all guess what that political choice will ultimately have to be. Now, this is not a people problem. The debt, it's not an economic problem, first of all. The economics is just a manifestation of a more underlying problem. It's not really a political problem either, in the sense that politicians can decide that they're going to make a change and they're going to fix things up. It's perfectly possible for every single politician to want this to go away and to wish to do something about it, and for us to default anyway down the road. Because this is legislatures are involved, and like any group making decisions collectively, they're subject to something economists call a mechanism. The mechanism is basically the set of rules that create the incentives and constraints under which any collective group operates, that's going to translate their individual preferences into a collective choice. Now, early in my career, I was called in by a client to deal with a particular problem. The CEO said, I got these two division managers, and the thing is they have to transfer a property asset from one division to another division. Manager A has to sell the property to manager B. There's no possibility of competing buyers and sellers. Manager A has to sell to manager B. And as you can imagine, the problem is that manager A is going to be asking for too much, and manager B is going to be offering too little. They would get into these fights that could last for weeks or months. They'd be dragging the CEO into this. And he didn't want to bother with this anymore. He said, Mark, figure out like an appraisal system or whatever so that we can deal with this much more effectively, because they're wasting too much time on this stuff, and it's creating animosity. Well, fast forward a couple of months later, and you have a transaction, major transaction happening, and the managers have to go through this again. Except this time, they come to agreement in 2 days without bringing anybody else into the squabble. What changed? What changed was a decision rule that I layered on here. I said, listen, you guys go ahead and do your negotiations, and if you can't come to an agreement, we'll take your best and final offers, we'll set those over here. And then you gentlemen will split the cost of an appraiser to come in, and the appraiser will find the value of this property, and whoever's bid final offer was closest to the value gets their price. Now, if you think through this very quickly, you can see how their incentives are completely different now. They're trying to estimate what that value might be, and they didn't want to be too far away from it. And in the negotiation, they very quickly got to a point where they were either overlapping or they're so close that they didn't want to dish out for the cost of an appraiser, and at that point they could split the difference. Note that in this situation, as long as the old incentives were in place, the old mechanism was in place, there was no way that we would have solved this problem by jawboning these managers, by training them, by cajoling them, or even by replacing them with people who are more congenial and cooperative. The mechanism was working against them. In a similar way, the government debt is the product of the mechanism that's driving our politicians. If we replaced all 535 of the people we have in Congress with people who are more fiscally disciplined, higher IQ, more cooperative, it wouldn't take very long, given the governance mechanism we have, before we would end up with something that looks exactly like what we're dealing with now. The core message for tonight is that mechanisms matter more than intentions. I was going to say they matter more than people, but people can design mechanisms too. Now, politicians, I'm known for making fun of politicians, but the reality is they're superb. They are the Super Bowl champions at the one thing the system requires of them, getting reelected. Really, they are. Congressmen, incumbents, win re-election at a rate of about 95%, even accounting for years like we had last year where you want to throw the bums out. They still got 86% re-election rate. And this is alongside an approval rating that is averaging in the 30% range. Can you imagine a corporation being able to manage that? 30% approval ratings, 96% return. What is that a symptom of? That's a symptom of monopoly. But it's also a symptom, when you got this huge divergence between how the individuals are perceived and how the institution is performing, that's a symptom of a broken mechanism. An easy way to visualize, and the mechanism of government is actually very complicated, but one of the simplest ways to envision this is imagining a huge table, 535 people sitting around this table. This table's got $2 trillion worth of cash sitting on top of it. And the only way to reduce the amount of cash that's going to be put on this table is to have individuals deciding that they don't want to spend their portion of it. They're not going to reach in so much. And if enough people decide not to reach in, then the amount of cash on the table can go down. They'll reduce their spending. But under that circumstance, can you imagine even the most fiscally conservative politician with the most sympathetic voters back home saying, you know what, keep that $200 million. We don't really, we don't really need it. Because that $200 million does mean something to its constituency. It will cause, but taking that away from them probably will cause a meaningful amount of pain. They'll notice it. And for what? For 1/1000th of 1% of the money that's on the table, going through all that pain for so little gain, what would be the point? And they would demand their share. When the bridge to nowhere was ridiculed out of existence, that's the bridge isn't actually there. It's $180 million. This is what they were planning to spend to connect these two places. Congressman Don Young from Alaska was arguing, not that this was a great project, but that it's not going to save the taxpayers any money if you take this away from me. You're simply going to take this money and redistribute it to other port projects, which is pretty much what happened. So part of this mechanism is that if a fiscally conservative person decides to forego a certain amount of the money, it's probably going to be spent in significant part by their less conservative colleagues. And how can you play that game? There's only one way to play it. Another example is Congress decided to refund at $250 million apiece the C-17 program, each of these planes, $250 million. The Bush administration didn't want them. The Obama administration didn't want them. They said that we don't need them. It turns out that these planes, at $250,000 apiece, employ 1,000 people across 10 states. We consider the fight that congressmen who are pushing for this plane were going through in a year of record deficits. You begin to see what we're up against when you're talking about pulling back billions, tens of billions, or hundreds of billions of dollars from programs that benefit so many people. Now, if I was going to devise a mechanism for Congress, we would get out of the difficulty in fairly short order. But no individual, no designer of any mechanism is ever going to be given that power. We just can't do that. So we have to rely on a little bit more of a blunt instrument, which is ultimately going to come down to constitutional amendments, hard limits on what Congress is physically able to do. In 1996, Congress launched a bold experiment in a mechanism. The Republican Congress in 96 gave the Democratic president the line item veto. The line item veto is a powerful mechanism. It enables the president to cut away certain expenditures while letting the rest of the bill go through. And for instance, Clinton, in that first year of the veto, cut out some tax benefits associated with Medicaid for New York State. Well, just the fact that he showed a willingness to use the line item veto, meant that he didn't end up having to use it very often, because congressmen are always conspiring to put their crazy projects onto a package, and they rely on each other to do that, to pass these things. It's called log rolling. But once the line item veto existed, every congressman was thinking, well, gee, my crazy project may end up getting axed on the president's desk. And that significantly undermined their willingness to support other people's crazy projects. And spending began to dramatically come under control. In the 3 years after the implementation of the line item veto, the U.S., for the first time in 50 years, had a budget surplus. It was the first time since the 1920s that they had a budget surplus for more than 1 year in a row. Well, those Medicaid cuts got challenged all the way to the Supreme Court by, of course, New York's congressional delegation. The Supreme Court struck down the line item veto as an unconstitutional transfer of power from Congress to the president. So if we wanted to get the line item veto back, it would have to be by a constitutional amendment. It's a pretty good mechanism. It's not enough anymore, but it's a pretty good mechanism. But another thing we would have to do is an amendment that prevented Congress from implementing unfunded liabilities. They'd have to be stopped from abusing its power to create further obligations that are unfunded down the road. If you want to create these liabilities, they got to unfund them. A balanced budget amendment is probably a very useful thing, and that's being proposed, and that probably has the most support. But it's not as complete as a ban on unfunded liabilities. By the way, another good idea, probably at least as good as the balanced budget amendment, is simply requiring the federal government to put bonds up to a vote the way most states do. That would be a very powerful mechanism. Now, the problem with the balanced budget amendment is that it provides a constraint on the government from spending too much, but doesn't provide a positive motivation for them to not spend too much. Term limits gets to the heart of that problem. Many congressmen who have come and gone from Congress will swear that term limits is probably the most potent thing you can implement, because if a congressman is going to be spending that much more time paying back whatever programs they put into place, rather than benefiting from having put those programs into place, that's got to constrain their behavior. That's the theory. Well, I want to conclude by suggesting that mechanisms are very powerful, as I said. They're more important than intentions. Mechanisms actually make us do things collectively in a very potent way that we would never do individually. And the mechanisms we're talking about have actually caused us to override the most powerful force in nature, the individual instinct to protect our young. And we go to extraordinary lengths to protect our young. We measure their infant formula to the nearest quarter of an ounce. Individually, we will abandon our jobs on the day that they're sick. We will abandon our weekends to go to their soccer games, even if they're second string. Individually, we do all kinds of things, large and small, sacrifices to maximize the potential of our kids. But collectively, we tag them with a $250,000 liability. These four toddlers have to figure out how to divide that up. The kids in this picture have got about $15 million worth of liabilities on the day they graduate. And these numbers are growing. And if we don't address the mechanism that's at the root of this problem, not only are these kids going to, as Mike said, be starting so far behind the starting line from their first day, faced with probably a lifetime of economic stagnation. But the real danger, too, just to put a selfish point on it for all of us, is that we adults could very well be facing a future that will be very poor, very bad place for old people. I just want to throw this up here. 230 years, we turned this saying from a truism to an irony. For those of you who understand balance sheets, these are the net liabilities and those are the net assets. This is my rendition of the black hole of borrowing every month. And I figure I'd finish it a little bit light as we go into Q&A. Thank you, Brent. All right, so I'll hand go up first out there.
Mark, you focused on the federal deficit problem, but you did not address the state and local fiscal issues with some very large unfunded liabilities that we know about. So without making a dire situation even more dire, how do you weigh that into the overall picture?
Well, the states, I think, are very instructive. Most states, something like 34 states, have a balanced budget requirement. Most states have the requirement to put bonds up to a vote. Their legislatures can't create liabilities just by a show of hands. They actually have to put it up to a vote. A lot of state governors have a line item veto. And by the way, a lot of states, a third of the states have term limits. California, by the way, has all of these. Yeah, just to show you how deep the problem can get. And they have, I thought, a $27 billion liability. It's a very big deal for them, given their scale, but compared to the federal liabilities, they're dropping the bucket. They do have their problems. It'll be interesting to see how they work through them, but they're working through them with all the tools, in many cases, that I'm already describing. So they may be the canary in the coal mine, but they're having that much problem. It hazard to venture what kind of problems the federal government is going to have dealing with its debt without even those tools in place yet. Yes?
Yeah, if other countries move away from pegging to the U.S. dollar and eventually the U.S. dollar no longer becomes the world's reserve currency, what will that have? You talked about the government's ability to print more money. But if that luxury does no longer exist, can you kind of take the next step further in the effect over the long term? Will that be like pressing the accelerator on the problem?
I think it'll have, that's a good question, but I think what we'll have is two counteracting effects here. On the one hand, to the extent that the US dollar becomes less fundamental, less of a linchpin of the world economy, the failure of US bonds is going to have a less pervasive or less devastating effect on the rest of the world. So in a way, diversifying away from the dollar as a reserve currency would probably serve to slightly ameliorate the problem that I was describing before, the nightmare scenario. I don't think that's going to happen in the next 30 years or the next 20 years. I mean, when I say it's a mathematical certainty that we'll default in the next 30 years, what I really meant was that analysts, bond traders out there are seeing that, and at some point they're going to discount that possibility, that eventuality, and trigger the default sooner rather than later. We don't have 30 years. We may not have 20 years. And that's largely resting on the fact that the government, the US dollar, is the world's reserve currency. So in a way, it'd be useful. It'd be a little bit of a diversification to get away from that. But on the other hand, I don't think it'll ultimately solve the problem, in part because the US is not going to be the first country to go down. Japan will probably go down before we do. UK will probably go down before we do. And when they go down, so goes a huge buyer of US bonds. It could eventually accelerate and not trigger a US default. Yes?
Very, very interesting.
There's a microphone for the folks.
It was very interesting. I have two questions. One is you described the solution that you suggest, the mechanism for the government. What do you suggest for the individuals? So do we buy commodities and stuff like that? The other question is about stimulus. I think that the last time there was a major stimulus, the whole highway system was built. So do you think, for example, that putting the Obama plan about the high-speed train, would that stimulate the economy, and can that add, in the near future may add to the debt, but in the long run reduce it?
Well, let me take those in order. Individually, I'm really not smart enough to know what the solution is for individuals. But we're thinking about it because we have to. And in fact, I'm being forced to by my family members who are aware of all these things that I'm talking about. Like, Dad, what do we do? And one of the solutions, because I'm not smart enough to figure it all out, is we are starting to talk about it with other people who are interested. And if there's anyone in this room who wants to be a part of that conversation, you're welcome to join us. I should have put my email address up here, but I'll do that in a moment. Because I don't know what the answer is. Because we don't know exactly how bad it's going to really be. We don't know how long it's going to last, the downside scenario. And it's not clear exactly what the solutions are. I mean, yeah, a quarter of our assets happen to be in gold, but I'm not sure that's the right solution either. So as individuals, it's worth starting a discussion. I think it's a really good question, and it's a question that we ask ourselves. And it's one where we're desperately searching for solutions. Because what we're talking about in terms of creating a global fix is a very difficult challenge, obviously. In terms of government investment, governments always raise money on the pretext that we need it for this or we need it for that. And the pretexts are always good. It's usually for the kids, right? The reality is that those pretexts are ways for government to draw the $2 trillion onto the table. The problem is how that money actually gets distributed. And the way it gets distributed has nothing to do with economic returns. It has everything to do with the political returns of vote getting and power dynamics. So, yeah, in theory, if we could take this money and invest it in a project that's going to create value for the economy, we should be doing that. But the two problems with that is, number one, I don't know that investing in high-speed rail or even incremental investments in the highways that would actually get the money is what we would call a positive net present value project. It's very difficult to determine that. It may or may not be. But the real crux is that once the money is in the pot, there is very little guarantee that it will actually get funneled to those projects. So when we saw the effects of the stimulus, I mean, they were advertising shovel-ready projects, infrastructure. That was the big justification of the stimulus. How much of that money went into infrastructure? Well, only 17% of the money was even targeted to go to infrastructure, and most of that money didn't get spent for infrastructure because shovel-ready wasn't quite as ready as they thought. So I say, in principle, I'm all for government investment in things that will create economic progress. But as a practical matter, the government has done a lousy job of allocating its funds.
Maybe again, there's an issue of mechanism.
It is,
Change
exactly.
the mechanism, you force them to maybe spend the money the way they promised to do it.
Sir.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to object to your last slide to a certain extent. To the best of my understanding, Alexander Hamilton formed the Manhattan Company, which was a water company, in the hope that he did switch it to the bank of the Manhattan Company so he could be a banker, which was forbidden at that time. So I don't think he's the right guy. However, you said if inflation kicks in. Now, tonight we drove the New York City subway, the transit system. I'm probably one of the oldest people in the room, and I can remember when it was 5 cents a ride. Today it was $2.25, 45 times as much. That's inflation. It's already kicked in way back. It's been kicking in and running right along, happy as a lark for many years. The third, you mentioned, of course, all the politically sensitive, the Medicaid, the Social Security, the old age pensions, all those things. But you didn't mention the departments of education, the drug enforcement agency, all those things which, in some people's opinion, we could get along without. I mean, I know, of course, that they'd be out there with the banners and the posters saying, support education, fight drugs. I realize that, and that, of course, is the problem. But you didn't mention that. You mentioned politically touchy things. Naturally, I wouldn't want my Social Security taken away. I paid for it year after year after year, and suddenly you're going to say the government is taking it away. I'd say you're robbing me.
Let me address that. I mean, first of all, those politically sensitive things happen to be the biggest items of the budget and the fastest growing items of the budget. All the other stuff that we think of as government is in what was called that discretionary spending category. That's actually projected to go down over time. And how that goes down, I mean, whether it reflects your priority or my priority, that's going to be, again, up to the politicians in that political pull for the money at the table. But they don't account for the growth of the debt, and they won't account significantly for the ultimate default. If you got rid of all of those spending, all discretionary spending, we would still default on the debt within a 30-year period. So that, I think, is how I address that. Now, we're getting towards the end of the time. I want to be fair to other people here. Yes, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'll get to you, I promise.
Mark, you mentioned that a balanced budget amendment, a ban on unfunded liabilities, and term limits would all be things that could help. In today's reality, which, if any of those, do you think actually could come to pass?
In the history of this country, we've got, I think, 27 amendments to the Constitution. And about 16 of those amendments were after the Bill of Rights, which was passed with the Constitution. When you look at the amendments that have been passed since the Bill of Rights, only 2 of those amendments had the effect of limiting the power of government. One of them was the 17th Amendment, which changed the way we elect senators. The way that amendment came about, I think, is kind of instructive. There was a populist movement that was out there pushing for the direct election of senators rather than senators being elected by state legislatures. Well, one state less than 3/4 of the states had approved a constitutional convention amendment, approved a constitutional convention for the purpose of changing that part of the Constitution. And Congress panicked because they don't want to have a constitutional convention because goodness knows what's going to come out of the constitutional convention. It could be a mess. And so they were pressured to pass the 17th Amendment, and then the states quickly ratified it. I'm afraid that it may come down to that. I think there will become enough of a groundswell, hopefully it'll come in time, for states to have a push for constitutional conventions on some of these high-profile amendments like the Balanced Budget Amendment. And hopefully the Congress will say, okay, let's stop the train and let's just do it ourselves, because if we don't, we risk a constitutional convention. I think that's fairly likely. Well, I don't know if it'll happen in time. Yes.
Thank you. When Mr. Rubin was Treasury Secretary and a colleague of Mr. Polson, and Senator Enron Phil Graham was in Senate, and they passed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act in 2000, and fair value accounting came in so that the banks can also use that to fair value all their over-the-counter derivatives contracting that was legitimized under the legislation that Bob Rubin and Enron Phil got passed. So how can you say that they were caught off guard when the correction in the markets, because fair value accounting says that you're shadowing like markets, so to speak. So the bank's balance sheets, which never before were so full of these toxic assets, were going to shadow a correcting market, and as a result go down the tube. So it surprises me that you took their acting job seriously. And then the second thing is in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution calls for the use of duties, tariffs, and excise taxes. So why, when we because of our international alliances and the power of the German influence on us, U.S. compliance with G20 is to go into these non-tariff trade agreements, also known as free trade agreements, to offshore production out of the United States, and they enjoy being able to be imported from these cheap labor regions without tariff. So Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution already would have required us to use the constitutional alternatives rather than something as, I wouldn't call it esoteric, but as dramatic as a constitutional, forum or something where we'd have to pass an amendment when it's already in the body of the Constitution. I mean, the founding fathers would roll over in their graves.
Okay. Let's try to address that. I think you brought up a lot of good points. Let me try to address a couple of them in manageable bites in a manner I think will directly address the discussion tonight. I think that as I said, I apologize that the mechanism that I was describing, the core mechanism that was driving the debt, is obviously a simplification of how the government works. But I was really focusing on a simplification to describe what would drive the ultimate default. And all these other items.
You take away the free trade. You repeal NAFTA. We don't comply with G20 agreements, so that we're now doing production, and there's tariffs, which is Article 1, Section 8 Constitution.
The tariffs, I think the tariffs, it sounds like that might help, because the tariffs would raise the revenues as a percent of GDP. But again, and it may help raise revenues as a percent of GDP above the 19% long-term somewhere. It could spur production, but it would hurt consumption. It's fairly complicated.
Then we'd all be being paid, Henry Ford, we'd all be being paid the higher salaries. If I do business with so-and-so, their people are going to be able to afford to buy my cars.
I'm going to ask that you table that question for after. I think there's a couple of people who have their hands up. This gentleman here. Mark.
All right, go ahead, please.
Hi, Mark. Thank you. The presentation is interesting. The way Nightmare on Elm Street was interesting. Two things. One is, clearly, just even by some of the questions, the issues, the solution is not going to come easy, right? Because everybody, pork belly goes for each of us. Like, we each have, our own issues that we really care about. My question is, when you look at Japan with, a debt which is 200% of their GDP, so they're farther along this road. And I'm wondering if you know of any countries that have sort of followed the progression that we're following, but that are farther along, and Japan might be the farthest along, and things that they've done that seems to have worked. Because I look at this problem the way you describe it, similarly to the way I looked at sort of the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and thinking, I can't imagine the solution until disaster hits. And so the question is, what has anyone else done, if anything, to avert disaster before disaster?
The history is not very salutary at this point. There was a great book that came out a couple of years ago called "This Time It's Different" by very prominent researchers, Ken Rogoff and Carmen Langhart, very good, very high-profile professors in this field. They did a great job that basically showed that the government's avoiding bankruptcy is actually a relative rarity in the course of history. Most countries will eventually default. And when you look at the countries that have lasted as long as the United States have, we've actually had a really good run. I'm not sure we're ready to kind of succumb to the global trend. To answer a little bit of your question, the states in the United States originally had the same breadth of power that the federal government has now. And in 1841, a third of them went bankrupt. I mean, the power was to incur liabilities by a show of hands. In 1841, about a third of them went bankrupt. Another third narrowly missed by heartbeat. And that was what actually created the impetus for the states to impose all of these other restrictions that I was describing that they now have. Unfortunately, they did go through bankruptcy to get there. The United States, the odds that we will get there in advance of bankruptcy, in advance of a crisis, it's going to be hard. I mean, unfortunately, I think we see an awakening in this country of the dangers of debt. And hopefully the message that, I'm not the one who created this, and there are a lot of people out there who are creating warnings. I'm just trying to focus them on what I think are a core problem, which is the governance mechanism, as opposed to just changing people or hoping for change.
All right, we have time for one last brief question for Mark.
All right. Let's say that's student here.
Hello, my name is Victor, freshman here. I saw earlier how you spoke about the airplanes and how they cost $250 million apiece.
Mm-hmm.
As to my understanding, the U.S. spends more than $750 billion annually on their defense. Right. How come you didn't touch on lowering that number? Because it's so incredibly high right now.
The United States, it's certainly going to have to lower that number. And in order to tackle the deficit, that's got to be a part of it. The issue is that the growth of defense spending is not being projected. Defense spending is projected to be going down. So it's not feeding the problem that we're talking about. We could probably cut defense spending in half, and it would have probably I'd say a 15 to 20% impact on the cuts that we need to ultimately avoid the nightmare scenario. So I think that's part of the problem. Or part of the solution, I should say. And I think that they're working that in. I think that there's awareness of that, and there's a push to cut down all kinds of spending, and especially defense, where I think a lot of people acknowledge that there's that. Can we take one more question, Mike?
Sure.
All right, in the back.
I'm off. In 1966, when the government put in Medicare, they projected that year would cost $3 billion, and in 1990 it would cost $12 billion, whereas in fact in 1990 it cost $200 billion, and today I think it's $465 billion or something like that. What do you think the effect of the new Medicare law is going to have? It's going to have the same kind of excess costs that we're projecting?
You mean the new health care law?
Yeah, and make your problem that much worse, that much faster?
Congress has a very bad track record in projecting the costs of entitlement programs. It's horrible. They had that problem with Social Security. They had to revise it in 1983. Medicare, as you said, it's explosive. And I have a feeling they're going to have the same problem with all healthcare funding, because the fundamental root of the program is I'm paying for your stuff and you're paying for my stuff. And there's no sure way to guarantee an explosion of costs than that kind of an arrangement. So I think that it's going to exacerbate the problem. It may accelerate it.
Right, thank you very much.
Okay, more fast things. Teresa, it is lonely at the top, but it's less lonely when we come to your CEO trust meetings. So thank you for this. Mark, you never disappoint. You never disappoint. You're always intellectually stimulating. I go tomorrow to work thinking about mechanisms I'm going to put in place to solve a lot of the stuff going on in the intramurals in my own company. So it was a great lesson for me as a CEO. If anybody in the audience tonight would like to be on the invite list for future CEO Trust meetings, you all know Teresa now here in the middle. Give her your business card, and she will add you to her E-string. I'm told that refreshments still in the back here are available until 8 o'clock, so we can continue the mingling. So good night, everybody, and thank you, David.
The email address you
I'm gonna put my email address up right
Yeah,
now. Very good. You're all dismissed, though.